Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a very exciting webinar in store for you. My name is Katie Watson, and I'm really pleased to be kicking off our latest session. Whether this is your first time joining us or you've been to one of our webinars before, it is great to have you here. Today's topic is one that is on the top of the mind for many organizations. It's third-party risk, specifically how you can get clearer, faster, and more actionable insights and visibility into it. Today's session is called Inside the Engine, a technical deep dive into Black Kite, and it's designed for those of you working in cyber, risk compliance, or IT. Before we dive in, I want to get a quick sense of where this group stands. So we're going to do a short poll all about visibility and third-party risk. So that should appear on your screen. You can just take a moment to fill in your answers for that. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by Linton and Cal. So Linton is our technical director, who many of you know for his straight talking and practical approach to solving real-world cybersecurity challenges. And Cal Ramkumar is the senior solutions engineer at Black Kite, who brings hands-on experience for helping organizations across sectors turn third-party risk into real-world insight. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you, Katie.
No problem.
Thank you, Katie.
It's all good. Before we go into it, just a small bit of housekeeping, and then I will hand over to Linton and Cal. This session is being recorded, so if you need to take a step away or you want to revisit it later, I will send out the recording straight afterwards or shortly afterwards. And we'll also be running a live Q&A. So throughout the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and I'll keep an eye on them and we'll cover them at the end of the demo. Please grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable as I hand over to Linton and Cal to kick off this exploration of Black Kite.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, really enjoying, looking forward to the session. A little bit of background. I've kind of been involved or had some engagement with Black Kite for the last probably 7 years now. So really looking forward to kind of unpacking what's changed because a lot has changed. And we try and keep this a blend of informative and technical and try and get to the questions at the end. But yeah, we're going to just hand over to Carl and kick us off on the demo.
Yeah, let's do it. So I share my screen here. I chose a couple examples of third parties to monitor to showcase a couple ways Black Kite looks into risk intelligence differently in this space. The first, I think, is very top of mind to all of us here in security, and that is Marks and Spencer. And so what Black Kite is trying to do is it's trying to give you an understanding of risk towards your third parties. And that understanding can come from multiple different fronts. And Black Kite has 6 pieces of high-level intelligence to evaluate risk on your vendors themselves. So if you look at Marks and Spencer Group right here, this is the company profile that you're viewing on the screen that showcases the high-level pieces of intelligence. So Black Kite has multiple dimensions of risk, right? So we have a cyber rating, which is holistically, what is the security posture of that vendor, right? Over 300 control items go into the cyber rating of a B, and this cyber rating has 19 different control categories as well. So within this B cyber rating, I can actually scroll down on the vendor profile page. I could see those 19 categories right here, right? So the way that Black Kite's doing it, right, is we're passively scanning the footprint of the external facing assets. So the first thing we do is, all right, what's the main domain, marksandspencer.com, and what are the other assets? We can identify the IP addresses, the domains, the subdomains that belong to the organization to then drill down into these categories to see, all right, do they have any vulnerabilities that are error apparent within their profile? Do they have any application security issues among their different assets that belong to them? And we start creating this threat matrix, right? That all goes back to a B, and each of these categories is weighted independently. What we have soon realized, though, is that taking advantage or being proactive towards ratings is very hard to do in third-party risk management, right? And when you're continuously monitoring a vendor, you care about proactive insights. I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to say, all right, they had a data breach today, I was ill prepared for it, and now my company has downtime from a third-party risk management approach. So Black Kite has delved into these different dimensions, right? We don't only have the cyber rating of a B, we also have something called the RSI, right? The Ransomware Susceptibility Index. And this index is from 0 to 1. 1 being very likely of a ransomware event in the future, and then 0 being very unlikely. And we'll talk a lot about that today, of how you can kind of use the RSI to your advantage when you're performing continuous monitoring. So this is a forward-looking index from 0 to 1. We have a data breach index, which is a historical index, right? If a company has had a data breach event in the past, how have they reacted towards it? Have they remediated their posture since? Right. Also coming from our external look into the company. The last piece of the external look is focus tags, right? Instant notification from a ransomware or data breach perspective, but also alerting you when there's a 0-day vulnerability that's maybe a celebrity event that a company is exposed to one of your third parties. That's all available inside these tags, which again are alertable into your email inbox, to your Slack, to your Teams, and you can actually drill into these for further information. So I can see the confirmation of the Marks and Spencer event, the sources in which Black Kite is looking into it, as well as the published date of the overall information itself. So all of this is readily available, and it's coming from the external view of the company, right? All the OSINT aggregation that's being performed. We also have a couple.
Cal, I think just touch on that a little bit more. I think a lot of people get confused around how Black Kite gathers that data, and trying to explain that it's actually not a scan, a physical scan against the environment. It's actually this public data that's all over the web and on the dark web and kind of collated. So just touch on that.
It's actually both. So that we do perform passive scans on our own against the environment, but the key word in that is passive, right? And I explained this a little bit before, but what we do is build out this footprint. And so if we want to get a little more technical here, we can. Inside this footprint, you can evaluate the specific domains, IP addresses, and the subdomains of the assets we are passively scanning against. So we're not sending any payload to these different assets, right? A passive scan means we just see the header information, and we can look at banner information available to then say this particular port is open or this particular service is open on these assets to then correlate them against the particular control items. So a great way to actually evaluate this is looking into something like patch management, right? So we see those different assets there. We correlate them against MITRE control items and NIST CVEs. And we drill into the patch management category. You could see, all right, there's 11 critical vulnerabilities associated. A big difference in Black Kite is we don't have any proprietary algorithm for scoring. So a critical severity in Black Kite is always associated back to the CWSS or CVSS score that's associated with the MITRE control item or the NIST CVE. So here you can see the asset we're scanning upon inside the subdomain, and that asset utilizes this product or server, which is end of life or end of support. Thus, we correlate back to the MITRE control item towards it.
And Black Kite also identifies the known exploitable vulnerabilities as well. So if that focus tag exists within that information, that gets flagged as well.
Yeah, so let's see if we can find a particular CVE. Let's go back. But that's absolutely true, right? We're looking back at the SysACEV list, and inside the CVE details, what you can always do is drill in here. And I could see the risk intelligence page of that CVE, and I could see all the context and details I need, right? So I could see what the overall CVE information is for sensitive data storage, the CVSS score from NIST, the EPSS, which a lot of people actually don't really know about. EPSS is different from the CVSS from a severity basis. EPSS is looking at the exploit probability, right? How likely are adversaries to be taking advantage of the CVE in the wild? And this EPSS fluctuates over time, much more than the CVSS score. So it could be a year after the CV has been published. EPSS score is going to be very low for that CV, considering patches have probably already been out for a while now. So much less likely to be exploited. And then you could also see the CV details. Has this been recently exploited by threat actors? When was the CVE published and it has been mentioned in the community at all? And then also, right, is it in the CISA KEV catalog, right? Has CISA said this is a known exploited vulnerability? Notice we actually have 2 CV details, one from NIST and also one from CISA on that.
Cool.
So I think a lot of people ask, right, there's so many CVEs out. I think there's 40,000 published in the last year. How do I kind of differentiate between them? How do I know which ones to actually care about? And that's really what Black Kite empowers you with, right? Black Kite has a research team of over 30 people that are constantly looking at this new information being published, making it available to you to say, all right, these CVEs, because they're in KEV, because the EPSS is high, because the CVSS is high, and adding the context in that layer to say, all right, from a third party approach, I would care more about this. And we use that towards our scoring in either the focus tags that Linton just mentioned, as well as within the RSI. So Black Kite's doing the contextualization for you to say, these are the CVEs to care about that I would then maybe send to that third party for further attestation.
How much validation is happening, Carl, from a Black Kite perspective on the data that's there? Or is that kind of more for the client and the vendor to discuss?
That's a great question. So for each and every single finding that's posted inside the platform, so this one right here, for example, there's 3 pieces or sources that needs to be accepted for us to post it. So we call it a triple verification method. If we find something, if Shodan finds something, if Zoomai finds something, if those are our 3 sources, for example, we then post it. If only one source posts that particular finding, we actually leave it off. So there's a triple verification process and validation process when we post any information on the platform. And so you were right. And when you said earlier, right, we're doing some OSINT aggregation. Black Kite aggregates over 1,000 OSINT sources, right? It's not just us picking one source saying and then posting it. And actually, there's a really cool diagram that I want to show here, because I think even more if we get into the weeds, like this shows all different pieces or sources that we're kind of attesting to in all the different places within the platform. So even something as simple as a domain name, right? If you open that up, you can see all the information here. You could open that up even further and see all the subdomains and see all the sources we're using for that as well. So what I often say is the first part of creating a threat matrix is proper attribution of the assets, right? And proper attribution needs a multitude of sources to be confident that these assets belong to a specific company. Black Kite's doing all the validation for you, right? So you feel confident in the data that's being published from the RSI or the focus tags at a high level.
So from a client onboarding perspective, you're onboarding a vendor, kind of key to that is to make sure that when that vendor is onboarded, that you validate that digital footprint, make sure that you kind of getting that full view of that entity. Because I mean, yeah, there's a certain amount of heavy lifting that Black Kite's doing, but you still need to validate that footprint, right?
I would trust what Black Kite's doing from a third-party approach, right? There's not much validation you could do on a third party, considering it's a brand new person that you're evaluating or a company you're evaluating, and you're trying to get through assessments. Black Kite's really taking it on for you. What Black Kite empowers you to do so, though, is the ability to add a subdomain or a product separately. So let's deviate away from even the Marks and Spencer example. Focus on something like you're evaluating a particular SaaS subdomain, or you're trying to evaluate a tool you're working with. That's part of a greater organization. What you can actually do is monitor the subsidiary or product completely separately in Black Kite. So I can monitor your Jira.com and have that particular organization of just Jira as a product instead of evaluating all of Atlassian's products. This is a really common example with AWS, right?
Yeah.
Because for particular cloud providers, you don't want to look into every single one of Amazon's products. There's so many of them. I want to look into just AWS. And what I could do is hit that particular domain in my advanced options. I would just check off subsidiary, and subdomain only. So now none of Amazon's assets is being included in that report. It's just a particular scan off the particular domain name of AWS that's being included inside the attribution of the footprint.
Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to touch a little bit more on that Marks and Spencer example, because I think it's pretty powerful to showcase the RSI, right? If we go back to Marks and Spencer Group, we see this different 6 high-level data points, right? There's also the financial impact rating that utilizes FAIR for our cyber quantification of if this third party had a data breach event, what's the risk in dollars and cents to your own organization? But inside this RSI value, that's really the powerful place, right? I think just about every single Black Kite customer utilizes the RSI, and they use it even more than our cyber rating. And that's because what we have done with the RSI is the cyber rating is 300 control items. It's a broad security posture measurement. What the RSI instead is focusing in on the 30 control items that are key indicators, right? These 30 have been handpicked because we based on the last 5 years of ransomware event data and utilize these particular indicators and saying, all right, these show a greater likeliness of a ransomware event based on real-time ransomware events that have happened in the last 5 years. And so instead of looking at all 300, we look at 30. And so software vulnerabilities, leaked credentials, Stealer logs that we're aggregating, botnet activity, fraudulent domains, information exposure, just naming a few right there from our technical indicators. Then we have a lot of business intelligence, right? Intrinsic indicators. So industry, they're a part of organizational risk. The DBI is all part of the RSI as well. So at a high level, you can quickly see where they are against their industry. But what people want is continuous monitoring, right? Today's RSI will not be the same as tomorrow's, will not be the same as a couple of months from now. And they want to understand new risk an organization might pose in the future, right? So the RSI really gives you that. People use the RSI to alert off of, to understand when to perform an assessment or when risk is above a preferred threshold for a particular vendor. So usually for an alerting perspective, people alert anytime RSI is above a 0.4 for critical vendors. And then for tier 3, tier 4, they alert anytime a 0.8. So you could see here how the RSI changes over time. I'm going to pause here. Linton, do you have anything to add on maybe continuous monitoring?
I mean, I think that timeline kind of tells a story on its own. I think that, I suppose the question I've got is, you know, clients using this, they're monitoring their vendors, and kind of not to deviate away from this example, but how do we empower the client to then kind of communicate with the vendor to deal with that specific threat? You know, what information do we share with the vendor to kind of say, well, look, we've picked this up. We're considering you to be a risky vendor.
Yeah.
What does the kind of the communication chain look like from within the Black Kite platform?
Great question. So the way that people usually utilize the RSI is they look into the impacts right here. So as you can see, the software vulnerabilities are the biggest impact, and the Stealer logs do too, against this 0.71. So when that alert kicks off, what people do is go into what impacts the RSI most and into those findings. Also available inside this report. So those 11 critical software vulnerabilities have the highest impact. Therefore, I want to focus in on those and actually can send those different findings to the vendor right within the Black Kite platform through what's called the Black Kite bridge. And it's really, really easy. I would just click into the findings button right here. That would open up a new tab inside the Marks and Spencer group. I would check this off, and I can actually assign and transfer these findings as a ticket to the vendor for their attestation. And this is why I pointed out to the triple verification method, right? Because sharing with precision is important. If you want to share findings to reduce risk, which is the ultimate goal of any third-party risk management program, you need to have accurate information from both a risk perspective of alerting off of it, but also if you're sharing these findings with them, they have to be accurate as well. If they're inaccurate, then the vendor's going to be mad, right?
Yeah.
So we have found is because we are so transparent with the information of what we're scanning from, and we show exactly the control item or their CVE attached, there's a greater attestation or greater likeliness of attestation from the vendor to come inside the platform to say, all right, these findings have actually been remediated, and they can update the status immediately when logging into the platform, whether they're a customer or not, and you could see it all in one place. So you see the audit trail towards assigning and transferring a ticket to a vendor as well with the Black Kite bridge. So in one place, you can detect new risk and have a response action from the vendor for greater risk reduction from either a findings perspective off the RSI, but also with focus tags.
And Kel, if the vendor comes in, marks it as a resolved or remediated finding incorrectly, what safeguards are in place to make sure that finding reappears?
Great question. So we have a QA process in the back end. Within 24 to 48 hours, we have an audit team looking into the finding, but also we do rescans automatically. So if it actually has not been remediated and they still have the specific version number of the product that's out of life or out of support, then we will re-add the finding into an active status, and you would see the risk once again.
So the vendor has an ability to kind of dispute the findings, but it will go through that validation process again, and we can say, well, it's still there. According to what we can see, it's still there. Unless you can provide additional proof, we're going to accept that finding.
Yeah, so they would literally just do this. They would press update here, right? And then they can add in an attestation. They would accept the possible consequences. And when pressing update, the change of status is immediate, but there's QA in the back end. Exactly.
Okay, cool.
All right. So for Marks & Spencer specifically, right, that's a really unique use case because of the overall event. And if we remember, right, in Black Kite, it was the end of April where we posted the data breach tag, right? And that's when they outwardly said they had a data breach event, we had a ransomware event, and we have downtime. If we go back to their trendline information, right, you could see that in March, they're at a 0.444, but then April 1st, they're at a 0.498, right? What people do is alert off those changes. They actually alert anytime for critical vendors above a 0.4. And for non-critical, it's usually above a 0.7 or a 0.8. And the reason behind that is that there's two key statistics off of alerting. We found in our yearly ransomware report, where we look into all the ransomware events that have happened inside Black Kite for that year, is that 70% of all ransomware events, their RSI was at a 0.4 or higher at the time of event. So alerting off that 0.4 is a great indicator for critical vendors. And then the other statistic is we found that among everyone inside the Black Kite platform, so all 34 million entities that we are monitoring off of, what we found is that 47% of the entities that were above a 0.8 RSI had an event, had a ransomware event. So it's nearly a coin flip if they're at a 0.8 RSI or higher to then have a ransomware event. And then for critical vendors, right, it's a great catch-all to say, all right, 0.4 or higher, I want to run a reassessment, or if I want to share findings at that time so that I can reduce the risk of that particular entity.
Yeah, I think I've got my workflow sitting at 0.5 for an alert. Yeah. So
that works too. It just depends on what your accepted risk threshold is, right? It's different for each company. It's different for your bandwidth of how much you could share information. But right, Black Kite makes it easy for you to both alert and share the findings right within the platform to maybe run that assessment or reduce risk.
Cool.
All right, so that's the RSI in a nutshell. I want to kind of pivot here and talk about a different company. And if you guys remember, the overall event at Marks & Spencer was actually a third-party event themselves, right? There was a couple consultants working at Tata that had internal network access in which adversaries were able to gain access through Marks & Spencer from that consultancy agency. And so if we go back to that ecosystem page here, right, you can monitor anyone in Black Kite as long as you have the domain name. So as long as you have tcs.com, marksandspencer.com, or any subdomain, you can plug in that vendor no matter how small, how big they are to be monitored inside of Black Kite. And so the value is that continuous monitoring aspect inside the solution. And people are literally displacing their entire assessment approach towards monitoring because they want to use risk-based decisions to run their whole program. And so if we kind of change our hats here and no longer look at Marks and Spencer as a third party, but say we are Marks and Spencer, how could we maybe have changed the discourse of events? We look into Tata, for example, and open up their profile. Let's say that they're a third party of ours right now. Very similarly, right, I want to look into the RSI, right? April 28th is when that happened. If I go down to their trendline information for the RSI, I could see that it started the year at a 0.543, went actually down in the year up until January, and then we saw the upticks, right? We saw a repeated uptick in February, in March, and then April, all the way up to a 0.549. So if I alerted in that April timeframe, or in that March timeframe when I crossed a 0.5, like Linton said, that's when his alert set inside of Black Kite, I could have run the assessment a month or two before the incident, making a more proactive indicator, and you could maybe reduce the risk. It's hard to say that you could have stopped the whole incident from happening, but you still would have a greater sense of that third party and new risks that might present to your organization.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about third party risk, and I think that's the focus. I think a few organizations starting to scratch further down the supply chain, the fourth and fifth party risk. Kind of how does kind of Black Kite deal with that noise and those incidental connections? Is there a way to kind of look at if for example Marks and Spencer's third party is Tata, is there anybody within that ecosystem that may be putting them at risk, which is inevitably putting Marks and Spencer's at risk?
Yeah, so a great way to do that is supply chain. So we have an entire supply chain model built out on our footprinting that looks into the third, fourth, and fifth party exposure of a specific entity, where you can actually use all the different data points we've just talked about to further examine those entities. So this first ring here, that's looking at your third parties. Right now, the overall model is based off of Black Kite. So we call this a pivot company. So Black Kite is the pivot company, and then we have Black Kite's third parties, fourth parties, and then fifth parties. The colors that you're seeing is based on the cyber rating. So again, the holistic security posture measurement of a vendor. But I can change this, right? I can change this to maybe focusing in on the RSI, for example, right? If I want to look into the likeliness of a ransomware event at an entity, I now can look into the RSI value, and the model completely changes in illumination. So if I want to look at fourth parties, for example, that are maybe red in the RSI value, Oracle being one of them, I can click into it. Yeah, exactly. And then what it actually opens up is a panel showing me more details of the entity. So then I can say, all right, should I start monitoring this fourth party? I, at Black Kite, do not use them, but then maybe a lot of my third parties actually do. I might want to take a further look into Oracle because their cyber rating is a C+. Their RSI is a 0.694. They have a data breach, right, 90 plus days ago, and all these other zero-day vulnerabilities that are exposed, right?
There's that kev tag as well, which always
exactly.
Yeah.
So it puts more context in, right? Adversaries have taken advantage of these vulnerabilities that are exposed within the Oracle environment. But I think this is the most popular, the most prominent calculation that helps put this all in context, and that's concentration risk. Concentration risk in Black Kite is how many of your third parties use the selected company. So in my tenant in Black Kite, I'm monitoring close to 1,200, 1,300 vendors. 417 of those vendors utilize Oracle and are Oracle's customers or work with them. If Oracle goes down from a fourth party context, does that mean downtime for my own organization, even if I don't even use them? And it could be, right? Oracle's a massive supplier, right? A lot of my third parties might use them for their particular business needs. I might want to start monitoring that organization even though they're a fourth party, it still might be very helpful. And that's what concentration risk really helps with. And what I could also do is if I go to actions, view monitored company links, I could see exactly which those companies or my third parties are that utilize Oracle. So
that could really help in, for example, the Move It case, the SolarWinds case. You can kind of do that analysis and say, well, which parties do I need to maybe get in contact with to say, hey, what are you doing about your specific risk here? So
so we actually make it a lot easier for SolarWinds or the Move It cases, right? We're publishing focus tags right on the entity. So you could filter against these entities, and I could say, all right, who's utilizing Apache, for example, among all the entities I'm monitoring? And then these are both Oracle suppliers or Oracle third parties, right? And Apache Tomcat vulnerabilities that have been exposed. But I can get very, really granular. I could say SkyTap, for instance. I can click into that Apache Tomcat vulnerability and see more details about this. So we did these tags for MoveIt, Log4j, CrowdStrike. We even found OSINT information to create CrowdStrike client tags, right? So we're very quick in our response actions. Our research team is incredible at Black Kite and helps us produce these tags against the organizations.
That's very cool.
Right. The most important part of this in terms of the tag creation is the IP address, the subdomain, and the product information that we are creating right within the tag. So again, if you ever want to share this information with the vendor sees exactly the asset Black Kite is scanning upon at the organization that is this relevant product.
Helpful.
Awesome. All right, so we kind of went down the Marks and Spencer rabbit hole. We talked a little bit about Tata. Linton, is there any questions you want to pose either to myself or maybe to the people on the call?
I think, Katie, have we got any questions that have come through that I may have not picked up on?
No, we're all good on the question front. If anyone does have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box.
I suppose, Carl, I did write something down here, and I suppose it was, so how does Black Kite adapt to supply chain changes over time? And I think it's a pretty obvious question now that we've kind of gone through stuff. So, if there's a vendor acquisition or change in hosting provider, how does that? How does Black Kite adapt that finding?
Yeah, great question. So it's all from our scanning, right, and our attribution. We run weekly scans or weekly OSINT aggregations, I would say, but you also can perform ad hoc scans against the entity. So if we detect changes in terms of their attribution, that's always going to be apparent inside their digital footprint. So if a new person registers a domain, if there's changes with the cloud assets from the IP address perspective, you can always see those changes right within the footprint of the organization. And so all of that is going to be done in near real time as we perform scans against the different organizations that are within the company. So M&A use cases, with any cloud hosting use cases, if you're changing your DNS provider, all of that is going to be available right within the footprint here.
Okay. Anything new on the horizon from a Black Kite perspective? Like any kind of insights you can give for new developments?
Yeah, so we're having a couple new data feeds that are going to be loaded in. So product level risk scoring, for example, the abilities to see some SBOM correlation inside of Black Kite will be available. And then from a complete product roadmap perspective, we have this brand new assessments module. So the ability to kick off an assessment by utilizing our compliance rating parser to then say, all right, RSI goes above the threshold. I want to see those documents from the vendor, such as a SOC 2 report. It brings the security policy. And I want to parse and map that against any framework of my choice, including my own custom framework, to evaluate the level of compliance of the internal controls of the entity. So that's brand new. It came out literally last week.
I suppose that, we haven't even touched on compliance yet in today's session. But I suppose maybe like a brief run through on compliance, and we can use Marks and Spencer's, I suppose, see what they map out, and then maybe I started playing with that assess module last week, so maybe just touching on that as well would be great.
Sure thing. Let me just turn my new UI on.
Which is very cool, by the way, the new UI.
Yeah, no, it's really nice. All right, so within the assess, we can cover compliance in a nutshell too, because both they're kind of, and then we can do one on Marks and Spencer because that is our use case of the day. So if I drill down into Marks and Spencer, let's say we got the data breach notification inside of Black Kite. We want to run an assessment right within Black Kite. So what I would do is actually go down here in my cyber assessments button. What do? Is click into it, right? So cyber assessments is completely privatized. Black Kite looks into assessments very differently than a conventional assessment. Instead of sending a questionnaire, getting it back, manually looking into how it correlates, what Black Kite believes in is taking any open documentation that's available, like a privacy policy, or looking at the vendor's trust center for information security policies that they have open, or a SOC 2 report that you're gathering from the vendor. What you can do is utilize AI to parse and map that towards any framework of your choice. So I'm going to say, just do a webinar for the assessment name here. Add any description. You can name this assessment, right? It's going to be saved locally right within your tenant for you to view in perpetuity. I'm going to click next. You can literally have any framework of your choice. So you can upload your own custom framework to be mapped into, right? Any control items within a custom framework for a particular regulation you're trying to meet, but also any of these global frameworks. So NIS2, for example, or if you're trying to have DORA regulations from an industry framework example, Black Kite is going to upkeep these frameworks for you, right? You do not have to do this yourself. Black Kite will look into new revisions and changes within the frameworks and make those revisions and changes right within the frameworks themselves. So then you can have all changes readily available. I'm also going to do NIST CSF version 2.0. Then you click next, right? We see a couple of Trust Center links in the very top here from the Marks and Spencer group, including their privacy policy. There's any support articles that you might want to pull down available to you that you can click into. So Black Kite's kind of taking those links for you and going to paste them right into the Trust Center resources, just in case you want to pull down those documents. But then you can also upload documents yourself into the assessments module. So I can click into here to upload, and I'm just going to do this particular SOC 3 report and upload that into the module. You have the option of either storing or not storing the document, right? A lot of people talk about NDAs here. Black Kite does not need to store the document to run this analysis. Everything is done in memory. So if you do not want to store the document, thus maybe violating an NDA, you do not have to. You can purposely say do not store. Black Kite will run the analysis, and then the document itself, including all parts of it, is deleted. So really doing the brunt work for you in terms of the mappings and analysis back to those frameworks. The last thing you have to do is just launch the assessment, right? So RSI goes past its trigger. You have a SOC 2 report you can pull down from their website. You have frameworks that you want to adhere to. You can launch the assessment. So right here, you could see everything in those snapshots that's going to be kept, right? So if, let's say, you alerted off of the data breach event and the assessment is run off that, this will also be stored right within the assessments piece, right? So I can see the focus tags, the overall cyber rating, RSI and DBI of the vendor, and also now it's doing the analysis, taking this particular SOC 3 report, and then parsing and mapping it towards the 3 regulations that we picked.
Might take a while.
It's going to take like 30 seconds to a minute. It's very quick. So, right, you just have to go back, get a cup of coffee, come back here, and the parsing and mapping would be done. It also, you can have an output report. So then if you want to take this and then save it as a report or send it to the Raider team, you can do so also. Perfect. So it's done. It now took that document and assessed it back to the different frameworks that you see here. You can see exactly the level of compliance towards each of those control items within those frameworks. And we'll dig into that in a second. But on the very top of the screen, you can also see a summary, right? You can edit the summary. You can also have AI just utilize the summary for you, giving you high-level details of how well they attested to or are compliant in the controls and the frameworks you selected, as well as their high-level grades and information here, including the RSI, the cyber rating, and also the control items themselves. So if you go below here, I can actually dig into one of these frameworks, such as DORA, and I can see the granularity of detail. So I can see here the specific section they're a part of, including the control item. And I can go to the right here. I don't know why it's so small. But essentially what you can do is say, all right, these are partially compliant based on what Black Kite found within the framework itself. And you can actually see all the details behind it as well, including all key pieces of evidence. If Black Kite didn't find anything that related back to the control item within here, it's going to say no evidence against it. What we also have a different, I would say, messaging around is what to focus in on the frameworks. The reason we have this unconventional assessment process is what we believe is instead of focusing on what they're compliant towards, focus in on the control gaps of these frameworks instead. So right within here, what I could see is a compliance gap report, right? It's created for me within the assessment. So if I click into that gap report, automatically what it's going to be pre-selected to is any particular control items that are failing or we have no evidence against, right? So these are the different things that we didn't find anything. Let's say I want to change this and also include any control items that a particular framework is failing in or they're partially compliant against to evaluate. I could see all details here. And then inside the evidence itself, I can actually click into it, see the description, which is the control item itself, the recommendation, and then here is what the overall AI found, right? This is a snippet from the document that's been uploaded. This is the reasoning or the AI piece right above it. So it found this, it synthesized the information based on the snippet that it found and related back to the description above within the framework or example. So, right, all of this is offloaded from your team. You don't have to do the manual process of mapping out the control items within the different frameworks. Utilize Black Kite, pull down this compliance gap report, which can be downloaded, send that to the vendor for attestation, and you actually can re-upload right within Black Kite itself. So very, very slick, very neat, and a much easier way or faster way to perform your assessment.
And also concentrating on the gap and not necessarily, the things that are already there. So it's less. I agree with you. Less on the compliance, which is important. But for this case, you actually want to find out where the challenges are and see if that's going to be a risk to you.
Yep, exactly.
That's cool. I like that new feature.
Yeah, it's definitely very popular right now. Among everyone we've showed it to has been resoundingly like, I love this. This is a great way to run the assessments, much slicker, much neater. From an endpoint standpoint, also, like Black Kite has a lot of integration partners in the space. So we readily integrate with GRC vendors, with VRM vendors. So any Black Kite data point can get pushed over, and you actually can still see the Black Kite data as you run your assessment within your GRC vendor, for example. So
I did have a question around integrations around things like ServiceNow or GRC platforms. Yeah.
We have a massive integrations exchange. These are some of the ones that are out of the box integrations that you can start looking into. So Coupa, OneTrust, ServiceNow, ticketing integration with ServiceNow, and we're constantly expanding, right? A lot of people come up to us and are saying, all right, I want to integrate with Black Kite or I want to use Black Kite in a certain way here. You can easily do so right within the integrations exchange. All the information is available for you. So if you're curious and you have Vendminder, you want to see how to configure that, you can always see the links of how to perform the configuration or it's the actual configuration itself that's available for you right here. So you can enter the URL, the client IDs, and client secret, for example, for Coupa, and perform the integration right here.
And there's API as well. So kind of just want use API reporting or API for reporting, that's available as well.
Absolutely. Any Black Kite data point can get pushed out of Black Kite.
Cool. Conscious of time, got it a couple minutes left. Are there any questions, Katie, that we need to address? Anything popped up, or are we good?
Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cal. Has anyone got any questions? Please do take a moment to put them in the Q&A. I might take this opportunity now to ask you both some questions, unless there's any more different parts of the platform that you want to go through, Cal.
No, I think that's actually everything I wanted to go to today. We went through assessments, we went through RSI, went through Marks and Spencer as an example. If there's any other questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to chat later on.
Fantastic. It definitely was a really good insight into the platform. And I think with third-party risk becoming such a prominent concern for many organizations, a tool like Black Kite really does simplify what is quite a messy and daunting process when you look at that task straight on. So we do have a question come in. Oh, Andre's just said, excellent presentation. Thank you. So not a question, but a compliment, which is great. My question would be to you, Cal, is what is your take on the future of third-party risk management? Where do you see this industry going?
Yeah, I think I see it from a lot of the customers I'm working with in Black Kite and Prospects is people are moving away from conventional assessments. They want to focus in on vendors that actually have risk towards the organization from either an inherent risk standpoint or from a residual or target residual risk standpoint to the organization, and monitor for changes of those organizations to then perform an assessment or share what caused the overall alert to fire in the first place for the attestation. So I hear that all the time. People are literally taking out assessments and only performing continuous monitoring for their entire approach for third-party risk in general.
It definitely sounds like a very efficient way to do it, especially considering how quickly things do change with the likes of zero-day scenarios. So to do it this way seems a lot more, in tune with the way that cyber and security in general is changing.
Exactly.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then a question for Linton. So you mentioned you've got your rating at 0.5. So I know, at Secon, we do use it. When you looked at Black Kite as a platform, when you were looking at it, what was it that really stood out to you?
I think it was, very basically put, I think it was having the sheer amount of data collated into a single platform. So in our use cases, outside of the typical third-party risk management, we've deployed it to monitor our SOC clients, but not as a third party, but to leverage Black Kite as an OSINT threat source. And we've got workflows set up to notify us or notify the SOC, for breach credentials or vulnerabilities that get picked up, automatically gets pushed through to the SOC so they can take some proactive action with the client to say, well, we've picked this up. So we're using it in a slightly different way from a SOC perspective, but I don't think it's unique. Chatting to some of the other team within Carl's greater team, that's not an uncommon use cases for people to use it to monitor themselves as well as their clients. MSPs using it to monitor their clients.
There is really a lot of value in Black Kite in terms of the wealth of knowledge and data, and you can see just how much access there is to it. And I think the UI and the usability and the ease of digesting that information really does take it to another level. I guess kind of one more question from my end would be to you, Cal, and it would be, especially considering Linton suggested a different use case, the Black Kite. Has there been a use case of Black Kite that you initially were like, I didn't think of that when you first encountered it? I appreciate this is a very question that I actually didn't give you the heads up for at all.
No, there was. So we worked with a regulator one time that had a lot of members. And so they didn't there wasn't a third-party risk team that I was working with. They were literally looking into their members that are part of the overall firm itself and saying, all right, if I can find, I would say, correlation or changes among these different firms, if they all experience downtime in a day, maybe I can use the Black Kite data for that example. So for example, let's say your food processor, and Pepsi, Coca-Cola, and another entity all have downtime in that day, you then would alert off of that and then correspond and saying, all right, we found these RSI changes in Black Kite that could have contributed back to it. So that was not a third-party risk example. That was a very different example and something that I did not personally think of as a use case, but Black Kite data still fits the mold, right?
That really does make sense. And I think it just shows the value of the platform and its usability in so many different ways. So we're just going to wrap up now unless we've got any more questions, but I do want to take this opportunity to say thank you, Cal, for taking us through that example, especially an example that's so current and in the news. And thank you so much, Linton, for joining us today to add a technical angle to our webinars. If everyone could take a moment, please, to answer the poll on screen. This will help us develop good webinars for the future. And thank you all for your time today. And I hope to see everyone at our next webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.